Hi, Tori. How's it going? You hanging in there? We turn the recording off until we get started. Great. Good afternoon and welcome to session R3, Virginia Woolf and the Anthropocene. Today we have a round table that has been organized by Peter Adkins and several panelists in coming together to what I hope will be a glorious conversation. I'd like to start by introducing Peter, and then also allowing Peter to then introduce the rest of the panelists, the participants that he's convened for this project, which is incredibly exciting. So Peter Adkins is an early career teaching and research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of The Modernist Anthropocene, Non-Human Life and Planetary Change in James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and Juna Barnes, and co-editor of Virginia Woolf, Europe, and Peace, Aesthetics and Theory. He is currently editing Virginia Woolf and the Anthropocene for Edinburgh University Press's Virginia Woolf Variations book series. I'm so excited to have you here, Peter, and to be in conversation with you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And hello, welcome to the roundtable. So as Shilo mentioned, the roundtable brings together contributors to a volume that I'm currently editing entitled Virginia Woolf and the Anthropocene, which is, as mentioned, is coming out next year. It's in a new book series that's being edited by Derek entitled Virginia Woolf Variations, which is being published through Edinburgh University Press. The ambition is that today's roundtable will capture ideas from chapters in progress and present thoughts that are still fluid, open and amenable to collaborative thinking and suggestions. So the way it's going to work is that each of us is going to give a short paper, pretty short, around 7 minutes. I think what I will do is introduce each speaker just before they give their short paper. And I don't think we'll take short breaks between each paper, otherwise there'd probably be more break than anything else. But I think we will take a short break once all the presentation papers have been given. And then there'll be some time where I hope the conversation will open up to the panelists between ourselves and then broaden out to the audience as well. So hopefully that will work as a format. And I am going to share my screen. Okay, so Virginia Woolf and the Anthropocene has grown out of conversations with colleagues and friends about the literary history of the Anthropocene and Woolf's place within that history, both of which I'll touch on a little more in a moment. My monograph, has been mentioned, The Modernist Anthropocene, was published last month and has 2 chapters on Woolf in it. And while I'm proud of that book, it also only feels like one piece of the puzzle when thinking about Woolf and the Anthropocene, especially since the Anthropocene impacts on a whole range of different topics, only some of which I could cover in the multi-author monograph. Speaking to Woolf scholars about climate change, capitalism, evolution, science, colonialism, species relations, war, activism, temporality, and materiality, among other topics, drew my attention to both the vibrancy and the collaborative nature of the research being done under the auspices of what might only slightly facetiously be called Woolfian Anthropocene studies. And I should mention as well, lots of these conversations have taken place at Woolf conferences. The Woolf conference has been really important for facilitating the work that this volume's coming out of. And the finished volume, my hope is, will help us both historicize the Anthropocene and shed fresh light on our present ecological moment, while also furthering our understanding of Woolf's literary commitments. So for my short introductory presentation, I'm going to briefly touch on the question of what it means to read Woolf in the Anthropocene, which I suppose is an extension of the inquiry of what it means to read at all, a question which, as we know, preoccupied Woolf throughout her life. How the Anthropocene might challenge conventions around reading criticism has been a fertile area of discussion within Anthropocene studies. In their introduction to Anthropocene reading, literary history in geologic times, Jessie Oak Taylor and Tobias Menley make the claim that at its most fundamental, narrative expresses a basic human imperative to understand our place in a world of water, weather, and rock. Literary history then provides us with a record of responses to changing environmental conditions, a kind of stratigraphy in itself. Anthropocene reading, however, goes beyond simply noticing what writers record about their environments. Instead, as Menley and Taylor frame it, the Anthropocene is a geo-historical event that can unsettle our practices of reading, as we pay attention to aspects of a text that might have previously seemed inconsequential or secondary, or perhaps only unintentionally or unconsciously present. For instance, we might, as Menley and Taylor suggest, trace the circulation of affects that travel between human and non-human systems throughout literary history. Woolf, I want to suggest, not only offers a rich literary repository in this respect, but is also ahead of us, theorizing the questions of what it means to be a reader in the Anthropocene in her essays. After all, Woolf was all too aware that she was living through unprecedented times. In her essay, Poetry, Fiction, and the Future, written in 1927, Woolf describes a present moment defined by acceleration, an age of being not fast anchored where we are. The essay finds Woolf looking back into the literary past in order to consider how we might proceed into the future. And it is an essay that insists on the centrality of the geological and the planetary in shaping modern subjectivity. Lyric poetry, with its ecstasy or despair, which is so intense, so personal, and so limited, is not enough, Woolf writes, for current and future readers. And as a side note, while I was rereading Woolf's essays ahead of the conference, I was frequently struck by how often she looks into the far distance to us, her 21st century readers. The reason lyric poetry is not sufficient is because, as Woolf writes in this striking quotation, the mind is full of monstrous, hybrid, unmanageable emotions. This is a rich quotation, and I'm only going to make a few cursory remarks here. First, and most striking, is the way in which the individual and the planetary collide, as we have to make sense of competing scales of life, the geologic and human, the personal and the impersonal, and to think on two tracks at once, which Woolf suggests is not the forte of the lyric. Yet, although Woolf at first appears to set up a series of irreconcilable oppositions between the geological and the human, beauty and repulsion, science and religion, the list finishes with the assertion that bonds of union only seem broken. As Woolf goes on to explain in the essay, it is the job of the writer to convey the counterintuitive connections that tie together human life and geological cycles, religious belief and scientific truth, beauty and disgust. The novel of the future, Woolf suggests, will be able to not only capture both scales of life, but the way in which they shape one another. How might one do this? Taking a polemical approach, Woolf illustrates the answer to that question by turning to what she considers a failure in this regard. And interestingly, she turns to an example that feels very apt. Singling out the storm at the end of Charlotte Bronte's Villette, Woolf describes it as eloquent, lyrical, splendid, but in the context of the novel, uncomfortable, since Bronte has led us to expect the rhythm, the observation, the perspective of fiction, when suddenly the reader is confronted with the rhythm, the observation, and the perspective of poetry. The reader, Woolf writes, feels the jerk of poetry as they are half woken from the trance of consent and illusion to which we submit when we read prose. There are parallels here, I think, with Amitabh Ghosh's argument in his book-length essay on fiction and climate change, where he suggests that one of the stumbling blocks for narrative when it comes to climate is that the novel deals in the prosodic, the everyday, stuff that is statistically likely to happen, as opposed to events such as freak storms that puncture the illusion of everyday life. It seems to be a tall order for writers to both engage with life on a planetary and personal scale and maintain that trance of consent and illusion, which Woolf suggests is central to a successful novel. One potential response might be found in Orlando, which he was writing at the time of this essay. In Orlando, Woolf develops a satiric mode in which the hyperbolic and the fantastical inhabit and shape the everyday, the quotidian and the extraordinary, the granite and the rainbow, everyday life and moments of climate change coexist in a sympathetic union. For Woolf, in her 1927 essay, narratives that present life at multiple scales will produce novels that are decentered, destratified, and resolutely non-anthropocentric. Dramatizing, Woolf writes, those influences which play so large a part in life, yet have so far escaped the novelist. This is how I want to suggest, in closing, offers a model for reading as much as it does for writing. In her essay, How Should One Read a Book?, Woolf suggests that we should follow the writer without imposing our design on him. This is not, however, a passive activity. Oh, I'm missing a page. I'm just going to open it on my, sorry about this. I managed to print off a copy of my paper without the final page, so holding you all in suspense. So here we are. This, I want to suggest in closing, can you still see my presentation? Yeah, okay. This, I want to suggest in closing, offers a model for reading as much as it does for writing. In her essay, How Should One Read a Book?, Woolf suggests that we should follow the writer in his experiment from the first word to the last without imposing our design upon him. This is not, however, a passive activity, rather it demands our active participation. To read them rightly, we have to bend our imaginations powerfully, first one way, then another. It is clear that reading is one of the most arduous and exhausting of occupations, Woolf writes. Exhausting but important, since reading, as Woolf points out in the final sentence of her essay, is both a civilizing process and provides us with the means to critically reflect on the violence often done under the banners of civilization. It is a curious concluding passage. On the one hand, it insists on the importance of reading and its centrality to both individual experience and the community. The social order it is implied derives out of the act of reading, yet at the same time, as the reference to an inevitable final judgment implies, our ability to read well, to read critically and self-reflexively is going to be called to account in the inevitable end times. It is in the second sense, then, that reading might help us construct a shelter against the waste of the world, a phrase which conjures up not just the earlier understanding of waste to mean uncultivated, unowned land, but also modernist environmental desolation. It offers in some a way of going forward with a mode of Anthropocene reading, a mode that, as Taylor and Menley suggest, is not so much an optional optic or lens that we can take up when we feel like it, but the conditions under which all reading must henceforth proceed. So that's my position paper. I'm going to pass the baton now to Christina. I'm going to put a link in the chat. Because we have so many participants, I'm going to only be giving abbreviated bios, but if you want to read their full bios, you can click and read them there, which I would encourage you to do. So Christina Rolt is a lecturer in modernist literature at the University of St Andrews with an interest in literature and science, particularly ecology, and is the author of Virginia Woolf and the Study of Nature. Her paper title is Early 20th Century Anticipations of the Anthropocene.
Okay, I'm going to try to share screen. Has that worked? Yeah, lovely. Okay. Great. So my sort of self-appointed task for this collection was to look into anticipations of the concept of the Anthropocene in early 20th century scientific discourse. And so today I'm going to offer 3 snapshots of early 20th century scientists who can be read as anticipating anthropogenic climate change specifically. And these snapshots might provide a backdrop for a discussion of Woolf and the Anthropocene, but I think probably as much by way of contrast as by way of likeness. And perhaps they suggest the dangers of thinking on a planetary scale in certain contexts. The first snapshot is of Svante Arrhenius. The Swedish chemist first asserted the possibility of anthropogenic global warming in articles and lectures in the late 1890s. He subsequently summarized his theory of anthropogenic climate change resulting from the burning of fossil fuels in works written for a general audience. So in Worlds in the Making, the Evolution of the Universe, which was published in Swedish in 1906 and in English translation in 1908, Arrhenius draws attention to the link between atmospheric CO2 levels and the temperature at the Earth's surface. So he explains comparatively unimportant variations in the composition of the air have a very great influence. If the quantity of carbonic acid in the air should sink to 1/2 of its present percentage, the temperature would fall by about 4 degrees. On the other hand, any doubling of the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air would raise the temperature of the Earth's surface by 4 degrees. He then highlights the significance of anthropogenic CO2 emissions in this context, declaring the actual percentage of carbonic acid in the air is so insignificant that the annual combustion of coal, which has now in 1904 risen to about 900 million tons and is rapidly increasing, carries about 1/700th part of its percentage of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Although the sea, by absorbing carbonic acid, acts as a regulator of huge capacity, we yet recognize that the slight percentage of carbonic acid in the atmosphere may, by the advances of industry, be changed to a noticeable degree in the course of a few centuries. So Arrhenius was not untroubled by the rapidly rising consumption of fossil fuels. He acknowledges the concern that the coal stored up in the earth is wasted by the present generation without any thought for the future. However, operating upon the assumption that in time, natural climatic variations would cause the present comparatively warm climate to give way to more glacial ice age conditions, Arrhenius finds cause for comfort in the idea that humans, by means of the burning of fossil fuels, have the power to raise global temperatures. He states, we may find a kind of consolation in the consideration that here, as in every other case, there is good mixed with the evil. By the influence of the increasing percentage of carbonic acid in the atmosphere, we may hope to enjoy ages with more equable and better climates, especially as regards the colder regions of the earth. Ages when the earth will bring forth more abundant crops than at present for the benefit of rapidly propagating mankind. So writing from the vantage point of Northern Europe and with the idea of fluctuations between glacial and what were then termed genial periods in mind, Arrhenius regards anthropogenically induced warming as a fortuitous byproduct of industrial development. The next snapshot is of Niels Ekholm. So cooling resulting from the depletion of atmospheric CO2 levels was not the only concern amongst turn-of-the-century climate scientists. There were also anticipations of planetary cooling resulting from changes in astronomical conditions. Writing in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society in 1901, Arrhenius's colleague Niels Ekholm suggested that in addition to climatic variations to be expected from secular long-term variations in the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere, the planet was already in a phase of natural cooling or deterioration, as he termed it, as a result of astronomical factors. So working from this premise, Ekholm sought means of counteracting natural trends of planetary cooling, and he therefore welcomed Arrhenius's contention that anthropogenic CO2 emissions would result in a rise in global temperatures. Ekholm advanced even more audacious proposals, suggesting, for example, that it would be possible to further increase the concentration of atmospheric CO2 by digging deep fountains pouring out carbonic acid into the air. Ekholm argued that by such means, it seems possible that man will be able efficaciously to regulate the future climate of the Earth and consequently prevent the arrival of a new ice age. While he admits that it is too early to judge of how far man might be capable of thus regulating the future climate, he reflects, already the view of such a possibility seems to me so grand that I cannot help thinking that it will afford to mankind hitherto unforeseen means of evolution. And the final snapshot, I wanted to mention one other figure, E. Ray Lankester, who as a British biologist was not himself involved in the study of atmospheric chemistry or meteorology, but who also articulates early in the 20th century a vision of what might be called the Anthropocene. So in 1905, Lankester delivered the University of Oxford's Romanes Lecture, which is a prestigious annual public lecture. In this lecture, which was later published under the title Nature's Insurgent Son, Lankester argues what we call the will and volition of man has become a power in nature, an imperium in imperio, which has profoundly modified not only man's own history, but that of the whole living world and the face of the planet on which he exists. Lankester presents 20th century man as on the verge of the fulfillment of Francis Bacon's dream of a regnum hominis, possessing the knowledge and practical power to control nature that Bacon's age foresaw but did not possess. Lankester calls for the control of natural processes on a planetary scale. Like Arrhenius and Ekholm, he anticipates the gradual cooling of the Earth, although he assumes a unidirectional entropic cooling, distinct from Arrhenius and Ekholm's theories of long-term climatic variations. Lankester contemplates means by which this cooling might be countered, even temporarily through human intervention. He suggests that in the near future, it will be possible to draw heat from the Earth's interior as both an alternative energy source and as a means of regulating the Earth's climate. He declares, may we not indulge in the surmise that man may be able hereafter to deal with great planetary factors to his own advantage, even so as to regulate at some distant day the climates of the Earth's surface and the winds and rain, which seem now forever beyond his control. Lankester's inspiration for such grand geoengineering projects derives from an unexpected source, Percival Lowell's astronomical speculations that the surface features observed on Mars constitute an enormous irrigation works constructed by an intelligent, technologically advanced, and politically unified species. Lankester claimed that he held a most skeptical attitude towards the specifics of Lowell's Martian speculations, but he nevertheless welcomed the influence of these statements about Mars upon the imagination and hopes of man, suggesting that Lowell's narrative of planet-wide engineering projects on Mars offered a model for the vast manipulation of a planet. So Arrhenius, Ekholm, and Lankester all anticipate the Anthropocene in the sense of thinking on a planetary scale and envisioning human intervention in planetary factors. They also exhibit a tendency to think on the scale of a species, contemplating the future of man with a capital M, but without regard for the way in which their conception of man is derived from the specific concerns and circumstances of the inhabitants of the northern temperate zone. So these are some examples from scientific discourse around the idea of anthropogenic climate change that suggest one way in which the concept of the Anthropocene was anticipated in the early 20th century, although this is not, I think, and very thankfully, the way in which Woolf anticipates it. So I'll leave that to other participants in the roundtable to discuss Woolf's approach.
Amazing, thank you, Christina. Okay, next we have Shinjini Chattopadhyay, who is an incoming assistant professor of global Anglophone literatures at Berry College College. She is currently Marion L. Britton Postdoctoral Fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology and completed a PhD at the Department of English, University of Notre Dame. Her monograph in progress, Plurabilities of the City, investigates the construction of metropolitan cosmopolitanism in modernist and contemporary novels. And her paper today is Cosmopolitan Anthropocene, the Convergence of Climatic Consciousness and Transnationalism in the Years.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Let's see if I can share my screen. All right. Okay. So can everyone see my slides?
We can.
Okay, perfect. So I will just get started. So thank you so much for the opportunity for letting me present on this very illustrious panel. And I'm very excited about the discussions at the roundtable. As Peter mentioned, the title of my paper is Cosmopolitan Anthropocene, and I will look at how Virginia Woolf in the years is entwining her climatic consciousness with her cosmopolitan, with her modernist cosmopolitanism. So in 2014, Anne Ray noted in the Oxford Handbook of Eco-Criticism that critics are just beginning to work out what an eco-critical or planetary account of modernism might look like. Since then, modernist studies has come a long way from making initial forays into eco-critical studies and has shown dedicated interest in examining the relationship between modernism and the Anthropocene. In particular, Woolf studies has significantly contributed towards disentangling the connection between modernist aesthetics and the Anthropocene. Christina Alt has famously shown in Virginia Woolf and the Study of Nature how Virginia Woolf's descriptions of nature is influenced by contemporary developments in the life sciences. More recently, Peter Adkins in his monograph, The Modernist Anthropocene, has argued that Woolf's late work echoes the Anthropocene's threat for catastrophic climate change and potential societal collapse, and hence is preoccupied with the notion of extinction and a future in which humans are no longer present. Building on these studies, I argue that Woolf's anthropogenic consciousness is informed by her modernist cosmopolitanism. I focus on Woolf's depiction of London and claim that the manner in which she depicts the city in her novel, The Years, situates London within deep history and simultaneously preserves the mutable local details of the city. Woolf unequivocally declares her cosmopolitanism in 3 Guineas, where she famously announces, "As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world." Rebecca Wolkowitz writes, with reference to 3 Guineas, that Woolf's cosmopolitanism is marked by a detachment from her own country and attachments to communities of artists and pacifists uncircumscribed by national boundaries. Keeping Woolf's cosmopolitan commitments in mind, I therefore ask, what links can we trace between Woolf's commitment to transcending national borders in her cosmopolitanism and her impulse of crossing epochal limits in her anthropocentric consciousness? Woolf's preoccupation with anthropogenic catastrophe and extinction is echoed in the fact that she frequently highlights the transience of London. For instance, in this excerpt from The London Scene, she writes that modern London is not built to last, it is built to pass. She explains that modern London is not built for the posterity, rather it is built for the present, and it will inevitably change with the onslaught of future transformations. Woolf, by highlighting the transience of London, situates the city within deep history. Dipesh Chakraborty argues in the Climate of History 4 thesis that anthropogenic explanations of climate change collapse the traditional humanist distinction between natural history and human history and make us aware of deep history. Chakraborty writes, and I quote, "In unwittingly destroying the artificial but time-honored distinction between natural and human histories, climate scientists posit that the human being has become something much larger than the simple biological agent that he or she always has been," unquote. He notes that since it is no longer a question simply of man having an interactive relation with nature, but human becoming a force of nature in the geological sense, the scale of history also needs to be adjusted. However, Chakraborty also warns us that anthropogenic species thinking occasionally dismisses certain notable distinctions. For example, he asks, and I quote, "Why should one include the poor of the world, whose carbon footprint is small anyway, by use of such all-inclusive terms as species or mankind, when the blame for the current crisis should be squarely laid at the door of the rich nations," unquote. Thus, anthropogenic thinking might erase the pluralities and diversities of different communities. I showed that Woolf's modernist cosmopolitanism helps Woolf recognize communal particularities in her anthropogenic thinking. In the years particularly, Woolf entwines climatic consciousness with how London is changing over the years. Each year or chapter in the novel begins with a contemplation on the weather and how it impacts the local details of London. In this way, Woolf closely engages with the local particularities of London, for example, landmarks, monuments, city streets, through a climatic lens, and employs discursive tours to reveal the transnationalism of the city's local particularities over decades. According to Michel de Certeau, tours divide the city space in small fragments and closely examine individual local details. Tours oppose a totalizing gaze and highlight the distinctiveness of local details, and doing so displayed the internal diversity of the city. Perceiving the local details of London as delimited and transnational in the years through the tours facilitates an understanding of the city as transhistorical. Woolf dismantles the binary between natural history and human history by showing how the evolving transnationalism of London leads to the transhistoric expanse of natural time. The framework of modernist cosmopolitanism thus reveals that Woolf's anthropogenic consciousness uses transnational local details to establish a shared sense of universality. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shinjini. That was, yeah, fantastic. Okay, next on a roundtable, we have Molly Volanth Hall, who is lecturer in literary arts and studies at the Rhode Island School of Design. Having finished her PhD at University of Rhode Island in 2020, with the help of a Mellon Council for European Studies Dissertation Completion Fellowship, she is currently working on her first book to be titled Base Matters, Modernist Environments of War and Empire, and is the co-editor of Effective Materialities, Reorienting the Body in Modernist Literature. And her paper today is entitled Mud and Dung, Woolf's Environmental Mattering of War. Over to you, Molly.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation. So I don't have a fancy presentation for you. You'll just have to listen to my words and let them kind of flow over you, I hope. Okay, so Mud and Dung, Woolf's Environmental Mattering of War. In addition to World War I's more immediate destruction of the environments of its various fronts, in the background, the background in scare quotes, the war catalyzed global environmental changes via alterations to supply chains, resource extraction methods, and fossil fuel economies. These shifting realities changed both the global landscape and the landscape of combatant nations like England at home. Compounding this, the war not only threw global systems of social, political, and economic life into chaos, it also called into question the very ability of language to articulate stable meaning in the face of such unprecedented material and epistemic disruption. As Vincent Sherry explains, this is particularly legible in the literary experimentation of modernists. Virginia Woolf embraces this loss of faith in the rational and mimetic representation of reality by placing a new faith in words themselves. Words are, as she notes in modern fiction, life or spirit, truth or reality, rather than merely describing our lived physical actuality. Not detached from an embodied material existence, Woolf's world of words matters, both as materiality and as meaning. While Woolf did not spend any time on the front during World War I, her post-1918 work is suffused with both references to the war and marked by the struggle to make sense of the new world, as it's called repeatedly in the years, that emerges after the war, after what she in The Leaning Tower calls a chasm and a smooth road that came like a crash and cut into people's lives. So I argue that it is through Woolf's troping of environmental matters that she most succeeds in making both words and matter again after the war, after these losses to both communicability and environmental integrity through World War I that's threatened once again during World War II. So despite her calls for an international society of outsiders that include the countryless women of the world and Three Guineas, Woolf's concern with meaning and place are very much nationally situated within England proper, I argue. She participated, as Jed Etsy has written, in the anthropological turn within modernism, where the ethnographic gaze of imperial Britishness turned with the contraction of empire in the 20s and 30s inward. And so she does this to find out what England was without its colonies in this new world to, as Nicholas repeatedly states, the need for, in the years, know ourselves. This new world would need very different environmental as well as political and social configurations. Mud, as from the title of my paper, and its viscous, sticky, distasteful qualities had quickly become associated with both publicly in popular discourse and within literary discourses. So mud had become associated in all of these realms with World War I very quickly. And for example, in his memoirs of George Shurston, Siegfried Sassoon writes of his protagonist's mud-stained mind, just as a small example. It's everywhere, obviously, in the literature. So this is his way of describing the stain that the war has left on his psyche. Like Woolf, then, veteran writers of World War I's firsthand experience also mediated the war through an environmental tropology, circulating most tangibly around mud. For Woolf, mud is not necessarily a direct referent to the trenches, though it is in many ways born out of that chasm in the earth. In her pages, mud is most often connected with what I would argue sort of two things that are separate and connected, this idea of a primitive existence and the creative mind. So though mud does not dominate the pages of any one particular work, across and within each novel, mud comes to be associated with land as a national but primitive ground, while also standing in tension with post-war ideations of Englishness as continuity and stability. And this tension is located in, I argue, the creative potentiality of the feminine or perhaps androgynous, but regardless of how we think about it, certainly an anti-heteronormative and anti-patriarchal mind. So throughout, mud represents for Woolf something that resists form, be that the form of civilizational, progress-oriented, or kind of equity-generating structure, or form the mind seeks to give its ideas in words, conversational or literary. For many of the men of 1914, those soldiering writers of war, the formlessness and deforming nature of mud is used to express the terror of the front and of an encounter with the world born out of the trenches. Woolf displaces mud from this masculinist perspective, however, where this lack of form is able to become then generative while still being non-reproductive, in a sense, through its exposing of certain things that are in decline within English society and making space for other things to emerge simultaneously. So the promise of this deformed creation is Woolf's answer both to the destabilization and trauma of the war and for the need to find new, more materially embodied ways of being and sensing within the Anthropocene. In her letters, Woolf uses mud to express a certain state of mind that is stuck momentarily, but in the process of creation. This stuckness and occlusion, this unformedness as crucial part indeed of the process, is indeed part of the process of writing. In a 1925 letter, she opens by saying, "I was just taking up my pen when struck down by the usual old temperature, which sinks my head fathoms deep in mud." Additionally, in a 1932 letter to Ethel Smith, she explains, "My own brain is to me the most unaccountable of machinery, always buzzing, humming, soaring, roaring, diving, then buried in mud." Both statements occurring after World War I evoke a noticeable wartime imagery set in an imaginary trench or arena of war. The writer is struck down and sinks, perhaps even in a naval incursion, fathoms deep in the mud. Then the brain as a machine, which like an airplane makes the familiar wartime overhead sounds of buzzing and humming, and then motions of soaring upwards, towards some idea perhaps, but then diving down earthward, not having found a way to express itself in language, interrupted again though by sound, a sound which might occlude the audibility of the desired phrase, much as noises and inattention often interrupt communication throughout the years, as words are never found, emotions never expressed, and speeches, especially at the end by Nicholas, by North, by Peggy, our three kind of hopes for a way to live differently and to know ourselves never get made. At the end of this metaphor of the embodied mind, the thought lands buried in mud. This muddy mind, while evoking Sassoon's soldier, is much akin both etymologically and imagistically to the muddled mind, repeatedly referenced throughout the years, most frequently describing Eleanor, the eldest Parjur's sister. Muddled refers in the years, similarly to within Woolf's letters, to a not being able to find the right words, a trailing off before finishing one's sentences or thoughts, but most importantly, to doing so because of the mind's multiplicity, often temporally, as it is caught between past and present or following many pathways, making associative connections. It is not so much an obstacle to thought as it is a profusion of connections, almost too generative despite its being an obstacle to the linear communication demanded by the many family conversations. In her discussion of muddy poetics of other female wartime writers, Kate McLaughlin states that mud, for the, quote, liberated female civilian imagination, constitutes a terrifying yet mesmerizing figure for creativity, and prohibited creativity at that, clearing up what appears to be a muddle, but what is in fact creatively chaotic. So this chaotic creativity can also be seen in Between the Acts, where mud is clearly associated with the feminine, though throughout, as Woolf writes, water, this one spot, right, on the property that for hundreds of years had silted down into the hollow and lay there 4 or 5 feet deep over a cushion of black mud, that deep center, that black heart. And this is the same water-filled hollow in which a maiden many years before is said to have committed suicide, the implication of which is that her existence, shaped and restricted as it was by patriarchal forms, became unbearable. But now this black heart of mud is to be rescued by Woolf, who has found fodder for its subversion and revision in the unsettling effects of war. Hence, after the productive failure of Miss Latrobe's play, she sits in the pub surrounded by the chatter of people. She listened, unlike many of the characters of the years, to the, quote, words of one syllable, which sank down into the mud. She drowsed, she nodded. The mud became fertile. Words rose above the intolerably laden dumb oxen plodding through the mud. Words without meaning, wonderful words. So here the generative capacity of mud as almost a new national ground in the mind of this uncoupled outsider female character begins to be revealed. And yet in both of the above examples and elsewhere, mud is not simply a creative matter for future possibility, a formlessness to kind of revel in, but it's also a primitive past of English culture. So in Between the Acts, mud is also coded many times as primitive, past-oriented, regressive, like Mrs. Spivens, right, or the moment at the end. Mud then also frequently points to the way in which English society is itself still primitive, turning the ethnographic, and racist language of the savage used by British imperialists back on the home culture. So for example, in Mrs. Dalloway, we encounter a mud linked to both an abjected but agential feminine, as well as this imperialist view that sees a horrifying primitivity that used to only apply to colonial elsewheres, but's now emerging in the heart of England. And so walking along in Regent's Park, Peter's thoughts are interrupted by, quote, an ancient song which bubbled up opposite Regent's Park tube station. Still the earth seemed green and flowery, still though it issued from so rude a mouth, a mere hole in the earth, muddy too, matted with root fibers and tangled grasses. Still the old bubbling, burbling song, soaking through the knotted roots of infinite ages, sort of like this sentence that goes on infinitely, right? The skeletons and treasure streamed away in rivulets over the pavement all along the Marylebone Road, down towards Euston, fertilizing, leaving a damp stain. So this muddy stain is grotesque and dirty, but it's also fertile. It connects this present England to a primeval past through its materiality. The hole from which the mud song issues seems to be both the woman's singer and the tube station entrance at once. And furthermore, this opening, when considered from the larger text of the novel, is really rent by the war itself, makes this song possible or hearable again, visible even. So finally, in the years, to return back to the years, the mud is evoked as a clear association with the idea that England must see itself as primitive in light of the war. World War I's dampening of the idea of progress, of civilization, is first felt in the conversation, or most clearly, between the formerly upper middle class women in their now more impoverished apartment, Sarah and Maggie Parker. Woolf writes, "In time to come, people looking into this room, this cave, this little anther, scooped out of mud and dung, will hold their fingers to their noses and say, 'Pah, they stink.'" Repeating, Maggie then repeats this cave of mud and dung, kind of approvingly. Later, during an air raid during the war, so this is before the war, and then we move forward, Sarah says to her fellow kind of bomb shelter residers as they're going upstairs, "Let us leave this cellar, leave this cave of mud and dung." Mud, brown, darkness, blackness, yellows, and deep reds all appear profusely across the pages of the years, across all different descriptions. But this kind of thrice repeated phrase explains to us, I argue, why those muddy minds of Eleanor and others are able to bloom, or unable, I should say, to bloom into this expressed creativity from within their chaotic muddle. Woolf associates the material and social configurations of England's early 20th century present, crucially before and after the war, as a civilization of people inhabiting caves of mud and dung. No more advanced than the first Britons, according to Woolf, England's people dwell in caves, evoking both the darkness and sort of Platonic ignorance to the real. They live amidst mud and dung, this material indistinguishability between inhuman matter from the surrounding environment and human waste. And so by associating mud with the regressive constricting structures of England's heteronormative present as a continuation from its past, but one that doesn't make any progress, with this creative potentiality of England's anti-patriarchal present for its future, Woolf employs mud, as I argue, as a metaphor for the interconnectedness of the patriarchal structures that, as she writes in 3 Guineas, caused the war, and the embodied materiality which people inhabit, causing both of those things. So it causes both its limitations, right, if it remains unacknowledged, but it also can create this potentiality if we embrace this reality. So these limitations, of course, are also the practical destructiveness they produce. These also include the environmental destruction that marks both ours and Woolf's Anthropocene moments. That's all. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. Yeah, another wonderful paper. Okay, next in the round table, we have Derek Ryan. Derek is a senior lecturer in modernist literature at the University of Kent. He's the author of Virginia Woolf and the Materiality of Theory, Sex, Animal Life, and co-editor of several volumes, including Virginia Woolf, Europe and Peace, Aesthetics and Theory, and the Handbook to the Bloomsbury Group. He's currently editing the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Animals, and his monograph, Bloomsbury, Beasts and British Modernist Literature, will be published by Cambridge University Press later this year. Over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Peter. It's so lovely to be here and on this round table. Particularly happy to see so many people join despite the very stiff competition and the other round tables. I'm sure we'll all be watching the recordings of those ones. Okay, so in opening his 1941 Reed lecture, E.M. Forster remarks that to read Virginia Woolf is to be transported to a bewildering world. We think of the waves and say, yes, that is Virginia Woolf. Then we think of the common reader, where she is different, of A Room of One's Own, or of the preface to Life as we have known it, different again. She is like a plant which is supposed to grow in a well-prepared garden bed, the bed of esoteric literature, and then pushes up suckers all over the place, through the gravel of the front drive and even through the flagstones of the kitchen yard. If later in this lecture, Forster's analysis of Woolf occasionally attempts to tame her writing, especially in his judgment of her extreme and unreasonable feminism, his botanical figuration here suggests her radical uprooting of literary conventions. Forster's rereading of Woolf following her death is, as Kelly Sultzbach beautifully describes in Eco-Criticism in the Modernist Imagination, an experience that reminds him of organic profusion or wild growth. Indeed, Forster's lecture might be read as its own experiment in bewilderment, moving as it does between domestic spaces and wild species in its engagement with Woolf's oeuvre. His desire to speak on rather than sum up branches off into various elements of more than human life that Woolf's writing brings to mind. The earth, landscape, a tree, a wave, the relation between objects, fresh air, dust and grass, flowers, the sun and waters, the countryside, dogs and food, the latter of which is treated to an extended reading. These were all part of Woolf's fascination for what Forster calls the outside world, from which her senses were always bringing her first-hand news. Forster's reflections anticipate the critical interest in more than human life that is one of the most significant and, to me, exciting developments in Woolf studies over the past decade, probably longer than that, actually. And we can see that, of course, in the brilliant work of my co-panelists, but also a number of people at this conference. It's incredible just how often questions relating to the non-human have been mentioned. But Forster's remarks are also prescient, I think, in alerting us to the conceptual and ethical potential in the very notion of bewilderment, a term that is currently under renewed scrutiny. In Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, 2020, queer theorist Jack Halberstam writes, "Bewilderment holds the wild within it and refers to an immersive sense of being lost or of standing outside a system of knowing or of merging with other systems of space and time that linger in the background to those we have selected as meaningful." Bewilderment, Halberstam adds, is the process of becoming wild by shedding knowledge, as opposed to becoming civilized by acquiring it. A similar reappraisal of bewilderment is seen in Nathan Snazer's Animate Literacies, Literature, Affect, and the Politics of Humanism, 2019, where it's conceptualized as an affective condition of disorientation, sparked by what he calls the more than human literacy situation, which is to say the various non-human agencies that in effect animate literacy events, such as reading, writing, teaching, but of which we are not always conscious. He proposes that this particular affective state of disorientation, bewilderment, might be the most productive way to open up possibilities for moving away from being man toward other incipient and furtive ways of performing the human. With these critical and theoretical insights in mind, and inspired by Judith Allen's chapter on how Woolf reappropriated the word wild to redefine it, repossess it, and reinvent it as a strongly positive mode of being for women, I've been thinking about what it might mean to read Woolf as a bewildering writer in the context of what Peter Adkins terms the Modernist Anthropocene, which is characterized by entanglement of the human with the non-human, inhuman, and post-human otherness. If common conceptualizations of the Anthropocene speak to the power of the human as a species that can do so much, in Adkins' compelling account, Woolf joins the likes of James Joyce and Juna Barnes in being concerned with the other, less aggrandizing implication that the human is the species who has been so myopic, so narrowly self-interested, so blind to its impact on the environment and other species, that it has created the conditions for its own demise. So as I've been tracking Woolf's use of the words bewildered, bewilderment, bewildering, think here of Orlando's most bewildering and whirligig state of mind, or flush, bewildered by the variety of smells interwoven in subtlest combination. And these are just two of dozens of examples that I could mention. What I'm finding is a mode of coming to terms with the diminishment of human power, or to borrow Adkins' words, a willingness to suspend anthropocentric thinking. To conclude these brief remarks then, with a view to what I hope will be a wild and bewildering discussion, sorry, I couldn't resist that, I offer a set of speculations and provocations that I would love to hear responses to. Woolf's bewilderment is a form of meaning making. Woolf's bewilderment is both feminist and queer. Woolf's bewilderment is attunement to the more than human. Woolf's bewilderment is the affect of entanglement. Woolf's bewilderment is ethical. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you, Derek. Another, yeah, just fantastic paper. Okay, we'll move, I think, straight on to our next panelist, Kelly Sultzbach. Kelly is the Director of Environmental Studies and Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. She co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Climate, which has just come out with Cambridge University Press, and is the author of Eco-Criticism in the Modernist Imagination, Forster, Woolf and Auden. She also writes for her local conservation organisation and does some volunteer teaching in the county jail. Her paper today is entitled Staging Collective Action for an Anthropocene Audience in Between the Acts.
Lost my microphone there for a moment, sorry. It is such an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you all. I am just constantly inspired by your work and really feel this sense of things moving forward for these questions in our discipline. And so it's really great to be a part of witnessing all of that. Okay, so let me get this situated here, this off. So let me see if I can also move this. All these bands to move around. You'd think after a year of online teaching, I'd have this figured out. All right. So let me staging collective action for the Anthropocene audience. And what I plan to do here is to walk through 5 major parallels between contemporary issues related to collective action in the Anthropocene and Woolf's Between the Acts. Then I want to wrap up with a question and perchance some quotes for later discussion. So to begin with, what are these parallels? And I will say that in choosing how to do this talk, it was either do I focus it on something small or do I try and catch the airstream up above and sort of skim the surface. So we're doing a skim the surface, which I might regret. It might come out as scraps and fragments, but we'll see how it goes, all right? And I won't do all 5, don't worry. I'm gonna just treat a couple shortly. But this first one, how do we grapple with a conflicted awareness that we are never fully a stable individual or a cohesive collective? And how we create collective change and collective action is an acute dilemma in times of crisis. such as in the anticipation of world war or the closing in of global temperature tipping points. And the characters in between the acts, and at times, perhaps even its readers, only can, and I love this idea of bewilderment in there too, only glimpse parts of the whole and question what roles they play within larger dramas. And here I'm thinking of Lucy's telling Miss Latrobe that the play made her feel as if she could have played Cleopatra, or the way Isa is proud of her social role as a wife, but marginalized in the mutters and whispers her private poetic voice has to assume. And of course, the mirrors turned on the audience of the present day, capturing discrete faces and legs, but also as an attempt to make the whole assemblage perceive themselves anew. Similarly, Anthropocene readers grapple with who they are as individuals and as a species who have caused and must now mitigate catastrophic climate damage. As individuals, we consume goods within systemic structures that are already scripted. What is any individual's ethical part in addressing carbon emissions or plastics? How does an Anthropocene audience advance large-scale change by joining organizations, donating money, voting? And environmentalists often struggle with that tension between their role as private thinkers or public activists. Of course, as Woolf reminds us in her wartime diary, thinking is my fighting. Thus, it is important to remember that there is much intellectual action, intellectual activity, and perceptual revision that has to be done before other forms of action are chosen. And it's that complexity with which Woolf treats our ambivalent membership in any community that I think speaks to the dilemmas of an Anthropocene audience as well. So another key question, how does privilege and identity impact who speaks for collectives and who gets to act within them? As Woolf sketched her ideas for Between the Acts, she was interested in thinking about plural pronouns and community identity, stating in her diary, I rejected, we substituted. And yet, in The Crisis of Civilization, Chakrabarty points out the uneven distribution of climate oppression in the Anthropocene, asking, who is the we? Reminding us that the responsibility for and the harms of a climate change planet are not equally distributed in the we of the human species. Although Woolf might not have fully addressed issues of race and class in her we, as a feminist and pacifist, Woolf is aware of her privilege and sensitive to some disparities within that collective we. Questions of gender, class, and power are present in Latrobe's pageant. The many representations of the queen, patriarchal wills, the control of matchmaking and marriage, police powers, all have central roles in the scenes. In this way, the we of the collective is one that plays with what Timothy Clark discusses as a Hobbesian notion of government's power. An image of the king as synecdoche for the state, conceived as a force to restrain human vices in order to promote group survival. As Clark points out, in an Anthropocene context, the collective state might be more accurately figured as a brute or a psychopath, creating planetary chaos and ruin. Likewise, Woolf seems equally aware of the way in which socially enacted collectives can both enact dangerous violence and exclusion, right? Consider the newspaper article about the girl who was raped by soldiers, or it can catalyze progressive change. Consider also the fact that Miss Latrobe cast working class people from the village as her figures of mainstream authority. Budge, the owner of the pub, speaking as the police, Hilda, the carpenter's daughter, and Mrs. Clark, licensed to sell tobacco, as versions of the queen. Recognizing the failures and dangers of collectives, as well as their potential to create alternative futures, is another aspect of what makes Between the Acts a meaningful Anthropocene novel. So now we move to how do we create a lived awareness of large scales of time, right, that reorient our individual lifespans within generations of collective impact. And I'm not going to say much about this because I think Shinjini and Molly have touched on this and given you a sense of how some of this can work. But I will say in Between the Acts, you can think of that in terms of, we've got this Points Hall, but we also have this ancient barn. Lucy seeing the whole day through her reading of the outline of history. And Isa and Giles seated as ready to begin a conflict in a cave, another kind of stage in the final pages, right? All of those suggest these issues are there. The collective is also, notice this is not a question, this is a statement. The collective is more than human. We are just one species within a more than human community of sentient actors. And Woolf, bless her, is just so always aware of this, right? And how she is constantly weaving that whole world into the human. And I've loved hearing some of these great panels about flesh and all of this, and I'll echo what Derek says. It is just really exciting to hear so many good conversations about this. So I look for that in the discussion. But for Between the Acts, some things to think about in that term would be, think of the wind snatching bits of human dialogue from the human ears, the trees, right, with their many tongues syllabbing, the cows bellowing that continues the emotion, the storm that allows the audience to weep for all people. And I know that, I bet, Rasheed, you're going to be saying more about this too. So I'm going to let that one go at that. All right. How do collective emotions of anxiety, depression, and fear on the one hand, or inspiration, hope, and a sense of shared purpose on the other, promote or hinder collective action? This is another one of those key common questions, right, that I feel I can sense in some of when as an Anthropocene reader, reading Woolf, and that, you know, the sort of critical, eco-critical discourse is thinking about. So climate denial, climate anxiety, and solastalgia, and environmental grief and nostalgia for what you know will be lost even before it's gone, are common parlance in eco-critical scholarship, and dealing with those climate emotions is becoming even more of an acute need for teachers and students, as Sarah Jaquette Ray documents in A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. The way in which negative emotions can produce a looking away or a sense of futility in relation to climate somewhat resembles the pre-traumatic stress disorder Paul St. Amour identifies in a typical of interwar literature in Tense Future. Between the Acts engages all of these emotional responses. Here, I think of Isa's fidgeting response to William's unspoken question of whether beauty is enough. No, quote, no, not for us, who the future, she seemed to say, the future disturbing our present. Similarly, Giles has a very boomer generational moment, I think, wrestling with his rage with, quote, old fogies who sat and looked at views over coffee and cream when the whole of Europe over there was bristling. I love how he can't find the metaphor. He thinks of a hedgehog and then he thinks of all the military things. He too loved the view and blamed Aunt Lucy looking at views instead of doing what? So, and while I didn't go into that there, it would be fun to talk about the formal ways in which she does this thing between collective and individual too. But Woolf's novel at times seems to question whether humans are destined to repeat patterns of the past in a way that might prevent us from attaining peace or achieving climate mitigation and environmental justice. But Between the Acts also offers surprising moments of transformational shared experiences that suggest the potential to revise and redirect social action. So, and this is a kind of turning the mirrors on you all here for the moment. I would like, if we think about for our discussion, I'd like to know, what are your kind of Reverend Streetfield-like thoughts on the themes you take away from Woolf's novel about collective action? Is it possible to take part in a unified movement for change if it is the nature of collectives to also always disperse? And what role do a plurality of subjectivities, identities, and opinions play in enacting larger cultural change? And I will say I've collected a rich list of notes from hearing other panelists about ways in which we are thinking about this, not just in this roundtable, but in the conference as a whole, as a question of ethics. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. That was, yeah, such an exciting, infusing paper. Okay, so we have our final panelist now. Rasheed Tazudeen is lecturer in English at Yale University. His research and teaching focuses on global modernism, sound studies, music, ecology, and anti-racist pedagogy. His first manuscript, Modernism's Inhuman Worlds, Multi-Species Metaphor and the Riddle of Being, is forthcoming from Cornell University Press. And he is at work on a second project on decolonial forms of ecology and music in the work of Sylvia Winter. And his paper today is Hearing Beyond Extinction in Between the Acts.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for these wonderful presentations and panels. And it's a wonderful conference as well so far. This is my first Woolf conference, and I'm really honored to be among such brilliant minds and ideas for the week. So thank you all. So I'll share my screen for a second. And so as Peter mentioned, my talk, can everyone see this?
We can. Okay,
perfect. As Peter mentioned, the title is Hearing Beyond Extinction in Between the Acts. We didn't plan this, but I think this works maybe as a provisional response to Kelly's fifth question about collective emotions, anxiety, depression, and about the possibility of some kind of shared purpose and hope, whether that's ethical or political, and we can leave that for discussion as well. But yeah, so I'll start this. So I want to start with a passage from Allegories of the Anthropocene, in which Elizabeth de Leffry theorizes Anthropocene time as the time of an anticipatory morning. So in this passage, de Leffry writes, engaging with the Anthropocene means that we must simultaneously consider the deep geological time of the planet in comparison with previous epochs, as well as the futurity of the human as a species. Futurity is marked not just by concerns about human survival or ameliorating species extinctions, but also by the fact that one cannot locate a stratigraphic marker for this epoch until a geologically significant period of time, such as tens of thousands of years, has passed. Thus, the Anthropocene is both forward-looking and a future retrospective, characterized by anticipatory logics and anticipatory mourning. Read as proto-anthropocenic thought, I want to suggest that Between the Acts is simultaneously a proleptic elegy for the extinctions to come, as well as a comedy of extinction, or an opening to the comedic unimaginability of a ground that persists beyond humanistic possession. Comedy is also an ecological modality, the surrender of determination to forces, beings, or temporalities other than the human. As a way of thinking scale inhumanistically, Mark McGurl has ventured the term post-human comedy as an umbrella term that, quote, draws together a number of modern literary works in which scientific knowledge of the spatiotemporal vastness and numerousness of the non-human world becomes visible as a formal, representational, and finally existential problem. For Henri Bergson, comedy can only be human, but it is also true that it arises only in the relation of humanity to something other. The Bergsonian comic too is possible only through an absence of feeling, a comportment of indifference towards the objective content of one's surrounding world. And Bergson writes in Laughter, indifference is the comic's natural environment, for laughter has no greater fear than emotion. The difference between ecological mourning and ecological comedy may only be a temporal or scalar one. Geological time goes on in comic indifference to what humans mourn. In Walter Benjamin's formulation of allegory, seen from the perspective of death, life is the production of corpses. And as John McColl adds, history, the building of ruins. Yet another dialectical turn of this perspective might see corpses, ruins, and extinctions as sites for the ongoing generation of being. And I'm inspired here by the earlier discussions on necropastoral in weeks past, or in the days past. So the comedic is fundamentally social. Comedy offers a means of participation with and surrendering of self-preservation to the Earth's creative unfolding of itself. Comedy also situates us, as Mikhail Bakhtin argues, as part of an unfinished whole, one that is continually composed by our actions and our modes of being, in addition to those of the vast and human multitudes. Laughter amidst and as a response to cosmic terror is a means of regenerating the world, an opening onto other futures beyond what is humanistically imaginable. So I want to look at just one instance of the post-human or inhuman comic in Between the Acts that emerges from one of Lucy Swithin's ecological visions, which of themselves are almost always comedic. So I'll just read this. She gazed vaguely at the view. She was off, they guessed, on a circular tour of the imagination, one making. Sheep, cows, trees, grass, trees, ourselves, all are one. If discordant, producing harmony. If not to us, to a gigantic ear attached to a gigantic head. And thus she was smiling benignly. The agony of the particular sheep, cow, or human being is necessary. And so she was beaming seraphically at the gilt mane in the distance. We reached the conclusion that all is harmony. Could we hear it? And we shall. Underlying Swithin's obsession with the geohistorical indifference of land to human histories and futures is faith in a harmonized, multi-species universality to come. This harmony, however, is only imaginable in the conditional tense and in the grotesquely enfleshed form of a gigantic ear attached to a gigantic head. What is the earth hearing with its gigantic ear? And what harmony or disharmony is it making of everything gathered into it? Sheep, cows, grass, trees, ourselves, all the noises, agonies, and expressions planted in its ground. For example, during the Valentine and Flavinda portion of the pageant, the bellowing of a herd of cows in the distance becomes, quote, the primeval voice sounding loud in the ear of the present moment, and in a scene that's analyzed brilliantly by Derek Ryan. And if the Earth's ear hears beyond human extinction, how might we hear with it? And what does the post-extinction sound and noise world sound like? La Trobe's pageant, as well as Between the Acts itself, might be one such gigantic ear, a gathering place for planted sounds, as well as a mode of imagining with the inhuman futures of sounds. They are also inhuman as comedies of scale, in which we encounter the impossible temporal and spatial vastness of the earth through modes of knowledge and perception that have only ever been humanistic. The pageant and novel modulate extinction into comedy, not in the sense that the end of human existence is funny, but only that comedy is faith in the regenerativity of the earth, along with a capacity to imagine other futures for both being and for sound in the face of cosmic terror. Like comedy, sound too is social. Jean-Luc Nancy argues that the visual is tendentially mimetic and the sonorous tendentially mentexic. That is, having to do with participation, sharing, or contagion. Yet the sociality of earth sounds might be one that doesn't include humans, or else includes them only obliquely. After the pageant ends, La Trobe becomes oblique auditory witness to an inhuman sound event, a metexic gathering of earth beings and sounds, in a passage that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Then suddenly the starlings attacked the tree behind which she was hidden. In one flock, they pelted it like so many winged stones. The whole tree hummed with the whiz they made as if each bird plucked a wire. A whiz, a buzz rose from the bird buzzing, bird vibrant, bird blackened tree. The tree became a rhapsody, a quivering cacophony, a whiz and vibrant rapture. Branches, leaves, birds, syllabling discordantly, life, 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 without measure, without stop devouring the tree, then up, then off. The starling's attack is also a sonic collaboration, a sound event that ongoingly generates more sound events and sound objects with everything that is discordantly gathered in and as the tree. Thus attacked, also a musical term as the initiation of a sound, the tree is made co-vibrational, shaken out of the stasis that it occupied during the pageant when trees were solidities that, quote, barred the music and prevented what was fluid from overflowing. The joining of bird and tree is rhapsody, from the ancient Greek rhapsoidia, the sewing together of songs, raptine to sew in the stitch oide song, a co-composed measureless generation of sensate sewn together noisings, which we can also hear both as La Trobe's sought after words of one syllable and what Woolf calls in her notes to Anon, the word heard, its solidities, its depths. Here, stooped to this ground, planted with these inhuman sonic effective articulations, La Trobe seeks a means of imagining with the earth noise that insists beyond human extinction. The starlings fly off, scared away by the passing of a villager, and La Trobe approaches the still starling vibrant tree. She crossed the terrace and stooped by the tree where the starlings had gathered. It was here that she had suffered triumph, humiliation, ecstasy, despair for nothing. Her heels had ground a hole in the grass. La Trobe's new art, perhaps, is this hole, the improvised making of an ear, a modest rhyme with the gigantic ear of the landscape, through which to hear and to hear with earth. The whole may also be a plot for the planting of sounds into the earth, from which new inhumanly grown relations and futures might arise. The whole composed, La Trobe continues her wanderings through the darkening landscape, where in contrast to Swithin's earlier musings, there was no longer a view, no folly, no spire of baldy minster. It was land merely, no land in particular. She put down her case and stood looking at the land. Then something rose to the surface. This something, growing from earth or rising from cauldron, is most immediately an idea for a future play. I should group them here, she murmured, here. It would be midnight. There would be two figures half concealed by a rock. The curtain would rise. What would the first words be? The words escaped her. Midnight is no longer oblivion, no longer the silence following the cosmic erasure of all being, the emptiness of night succeeding only to night, but rather the time of inhumanly sounded and futured creation. Latrobe's and Woolf's and Anand's impersonalization of land is also passage to the Earth's comedic and interspecies ongoingness, and a mode of hearing towards and with the unimaginable futures on the other side of extinction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rasheed. Yeah, great. And I love the crying with laughter emojis. Really fitting. And hopefully fitting for the presentations as a whole. Hopefully it's filled everyone that level of joy, yeah, ready to discuss. I think we will take a few minutes break, so we'll reconvene at 55 past the hour, whichever hour it is, wherever you are, and then we'll dive into discussion. Okay, hopefully that has been just about enough time to stretch your legs and maybe get a glass of water. So I think what we'll do is I'm just going to give a very brief response, and then the panelists and Shilo, you as well, you're welcome to join in here, especially since you're also a contributor to the volume and your work came up several times. Want to sort of jump in, share thoughts, share ideas, and then we'll sort of organically let it broaden out to the audience. So if, you know, at a certain point, someone from the audience wants to raise their hand or just jump in, I think we'll just let it sort of unfold naturally. So just a few remarks and responses just to get the ball rolling, although we've got lots of prompts already in front of us to chew on, but just some thoughts that came up from the connections. I'm really intrigued and interested how, although our discussion has been really wide-ranging, there seems to be certain parts of Woolf's life or Woolf's periods in Woolf's writing life that we're clustering around, especially it seems to be the 1930s up into towards the end of her life, and as well maybe the beginning of her life as well, which is kind of interesting to think about if we're thinking about if we can track the sort of development in Woolf's environmental thought, whether we could sort of have a stratigraphy of Woolf as a writer for someone whose commitments, ideas, aesthetics, and ethics change, and how that might be reflected in where we're sort of predisposed to go when we're thinking about Woolf and the environment. And related to that, I guess, is this question that came up in both Elsa and Gretchen's keynotes in the last couple of days about the uncertain relationship between ethics and politics, how ethics doesn't necessarily neatly translate into politics, and the way we're sort of maybe, there's a sense in which we were getting at some of those questions in an indirect way in the papers today. And I guess that relates to this question of thinking as being my fighting, which Kelly quoted. It was Kelly who quoted that, wasn't it? It was you, yeah, nodding, Kelly's nodding, which I think is really interesting for thinking about those links between aesthetics and activism and about Woolf studies and activism, but also thinking about the limitations when thinking is your fighting. You know, to what degree is that enough? To what degree can thinking be fighting when it comes to environmental issues? And finally, just something a little lighter, which is just the way in which mud seemed to seep through a lot of these presentations. Obviously, Molly's, that was very mud-centric, but yeah, I was struck again by thinking about the relationship between words and matter that Rasheed was finishing with Between the Acts, and the sort of materiality of the word that seemed to come up in several of the presentations. So that's just some sort of scattershot thoughts from me. I'll hand it over now to see who wants to take the mantle next. And I should say, I think it would just be easier just for people to speak rather than raise your hands. And hopefully, if we're on that gallery view, everyone will be able to see when people are going to speak. Okay, we do have a hand raised, Savina.
Yeah, I'm really moved. Thank you for such brilliant papers. That's my first time with you, and I'm just thrilled. I was just thinking about Between the Acts, and Kelly, you made me think about so many things, and I find this novel very challenging because it is also highly contradictory somehow. It is very complex, and it contains it all. Fragments on the surface, everything seems to be broken, or it's scrapped fragments, but also unity in the depths. So she somehow pieces things back together, despite her explicit denial of art's remedial ability. She says it's death when illusion fades. I don't know if I'm quoting right. And also the audience, you mentioned the mirrors who don't recognize themselves, not even in the mirror scene, and the dots she uses when the Reverend speaks. So form is testifying to fragmentation, to separation, up, dots, opportunity, or I don't remember, there are some other instances of the use of dots. So, and also when finally Isose talks about the threefold ply that is broken. So there is, everything testifies to failure and rupture, but both nature, I find, and words materiality helps in rebuilding what is being broken, because let me find, when Isa talks about the wave has broken, if you read it, I'm sorry, I'm not a mother tongue, so I may be totally wrong, but I'll try. She said, dispersed are we. Isabella followed her, humming, all is over, the wave has broken, left us stranded, high and dry, single, separate on the shingle, broken is the threefold ply. There is rhythm there. So words are there just to put things together, in spite of the fact that Woolf does not believe in that. And also nature fills in the gaps. The cows do so when the wind blows the words away. So I don't know, and Miss Latrobe too, she finds inspiration again in the mud. So I guess it is a very complex, even contradictory way that helps us to rebuild pieces together through nature, through words, matter, reality. I don't know, that's just an idea, and thank you all for your wonderful papers and suggestions. Thank you.
Yeah, and it is, I have that experience as a reader too. Like I have trouble picking out any quote from Woolf because all the rest of it needs to come with it, right? Almost like, you know, the boy seeing that flower whole. You can't just hold the flower, you have to grab the mud too. And there's something about that that makes it very difficult to talk about Woolf as a scholar. But I will say one of the things that helps me, that I'm taking from this conference, talk about some of the things that you brought up, was Shilo's idea of this compost heap, right? The way in which something must disintegrate, that disintegration is part of the process. And I think that's been said by others here too. And Derek alluded to that as well. That is, that sense of not knowing has to be there in order to create the comprehension of what we do know. So when she creates those binaries, like you mentioned the word that is split up when the Reverend talks, I love how opportunity, right? It's split by the airplane. It still has unity in it. So even as she's splitting it, one of the pieces refers back to the whole. I mean, it's tremendous how she does that. And then that compost heap, I did think about that when I was listening to your talk too here, Molly, right? The cesspool that then becomes the fertile mud. You know, we open the novel with that cesspool, which also relates to systems and pipes and things that are either going to be brought by governmental organizations or they're not. And then we end with, you know, the fertile potential of just who knows what's going to come from those single word syllables. And I think that all of that gets to what you're talking about. And I've listened, I was at the science panel yesterday, and I don't know if this person is here, talked about entrainment, the way our brains hear rhythm and then want to repeat that rhythm. And song is really important to Between the Acts. And the way song changes, and towards the end, she gets at this riffle, raffle, jaffle that sounds like jazz, you know, or she even refers to it, I think, as jazz. And so I think she's constantly working with that, instead of a binary, a dialectic between what we can do with the breakness and the unity. And, you know, when I decided to become a modernist as an eco-critical scholar, it was because of Woolf. It was because I feel she captured something about hope in a way that felt realistic to me. It wasn't just a facile, you know, pastoral kind of thing. It was more of that anti-pastoral, complex pastoral sense of welcoming the bewilderment and the brokenness as a way to rethink with humility. That really resonated with me. See, I have a tendency to talk too much, so like I'm going to stop now. Thank you. It was really helpful.
Would anyone want to follow up on that, come in on that, continue the thought?
I have a slightly different point, but maybe picking up from that. Thank you for everyone. It was really, really nice. And I think my comment / question, bear with me, I will try to kind of formulate it into a neater question. But so thank you, Shinjini. Do I pronounce your name correctly? thank you for bringing together this idea of transnationalism or cosmopolitanism with this kind of eco-criticism or anthropocentrism criticism. I think it's because I think when you do transnational modernist studies or global modernist studies, it can often become this kind of add-on to the other things. And when you do this, it kind of gets lost in this kind of eco-criticism. So trying to bring these two things together, I think it's very nice for you to do that. And I had a more kind of smaller direct question, I guess, to you and your presentation about how your presentation, I mean, it touched upon it, but how does it relate to the critique of imperialism, and what do you do with this sense of imperialism, especially, I guess, from Anglo-American point of view in this transnational context? But so to kind of maybe open it up more to the other panelists and to kind of come back to Kelly's questions at the end of her presentation. So about this we, and, you know, there's this class and race and gender, all these differences or incomprehensions. Like, how do we allow for these things when we talk about this anthropocentrism or eco-criticism that seems to be kind of universal? Like, is it universal? And then Derek's presentation was mentioning this, you mentioned myopia as a kind of negative thing, I think, but I've been thinking about myopia as also like a certain potential to really pay attention to something specific. So I'm wondering, I don't know what the kind of logical question would be, but I think just this idea of how can you allow for this kind of, I don't know, regional or local differences within this like study of eco-criticism, anthropocentrism. And I think so many presentations have touched upon it, like, you know, references to Sweden and the Nordic place. And it's kind of like, so I'm just thinking if you can expand on that a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. If I could just attempt to answer that. So I believe that transnational modernism and contemporary eco-criticism significantly overlap in the way they are approaching imperialism, and they're taking up decolonial approaches, because in different ways, both schools of thought are talking about the different power dynamics that imperialism has created, and it's trying to kind of deconstruct that power dynamic. It's trying to displace the hegemony of the imperial center, and then it's bringing into focus the so-called colonial outposts, and it's trying to kind of dismantle that hegemony of power, and that's kind of the core of modernist cosmopolitanism. So it's not just about internationalism, but it's also about how the cultural differences of the imperial center and the colonial, the formerly colonized locations are being approached from a more egalitarian perspective, and we are kind of getting this same kind of approach from eco-criticism as well, where it's committed to kind of displacing the imperial center, and it's drawing attention to the formerly colonized locations. And that's what I'm trying to do in my chapter. I'm trying to highlight these overlaps between modernist cosmopolitanism and modernist anthropocenic consciousness, that although they might seem to be contradictory, because cosmopolitanism is about the very local, the very immediate, and eco-criticism is about these large-scale, deep history, it seems to apparently ignore the particularities, and hence they seem to be mutually exclusive. But I'm trying to show that it's actually the contrary. They're actually overlapping. They have similar goals and aims.
Thank you.
I guess just following up on that, this is maybe a question I had for, the panelists as well as maybe just the whole audience. And it's just in relation to that question about imperialism, what is at stake, or why are we sticking to the term Anthropocene, or like what's at stake in our use of that term, rather than like thinking about other variations of it that try to put, it's Chakrabarty's arguing, but as other theorists since then have argued, that Anthropocene privileges Western man, or it kind of like gives over the kind of agency of planetary change to a kind of abstract, disembodied version of man, rather than like in imperialism and settler colonialism and slavery, in genocide of indigenous peoples. And there's a sentence I was thinking of from Catherine Yusuf's. I'll just paste it in the chat because it's just such a powerful sentence to me that just kind of like changed all of my ecological and political thinking. But the Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialisms have been ending worlds for as long as they have been in existence. And so when we think about like golden spikes, when the Anthropocene began, was it the steam engine? Was it the great acceleration in the 1940s? Or in Christina's really excellent paper, thinking about planetary change in the early 20th century. I mean, was it 1492? Was it 1441 when the first, when the beginnings of slavery emerged? And should we, kind of integrate this kind of thing, or not even integrate this, but reframe our entire orientation around Anthropocene through genocide and settler colonialism and slavery, rather than a kind of disembodied version of man? So I don't like, for me, my idea of Anthropocene, the reason why I would be okay with using it is just as a shorthand, or as a kind of like metonym that stands for many things. I'll write the author's name. So anyway, yeah, I'm just interested in like what is at stake in our use of Anthropocene, and that's a very broad question for anyone to pick up.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that? Liana's had her hand raised very patiently, but that is a really, I think, important and rich provocation. And maybe I'll just say briefly, and then we'll go to Liana's question, which is that I hope part of what the book can do is work towards reading Woolf as a way of problematizing that understanding of the Anthropocene, and the intellectual history of the Anthropocene, which comes out of quite a narrow understanding of the human, or a narrow definition of the human, I suppose, in which a white Western idea of subjectivity is taken as in a sort of universalist way, and there was a lot of pushback and critiques, and rightly so, I think, especially from scholars who've been pointing out that various fields like post-colonial theory, like deconstruction, like feminism and queer theory have been for a long time actually trying to unpick that idea of a universalist subjectivity that can be used as a sort of measuring stick. I can see lots of activity going on in the chat box, which is kind of distracting me. I'm wondering if people are sort of adding to, there's lots of good points being made about it in the chat box. But Liana, you've been very patient in having your hand up for a while, so maybe I'll stop talking and you can take over.
No worries. Thank you, Peter. At least you don't have to like keep your hand up physically for a long time in Zoom, right? Well, first of all, thank you all so much. That was so rich and exciting and such wonderful readings. And I think I was really struck by Derek's focusing on bewilderment. And I loved the questions that he posed at the end of kind of continuing this train of thought of bewilderment, and like, how could we continue to theorize that as like a reading practice, or like an Anthropocene thinking? Because to me, like thinking about bewilderment, that seems like it could have a positive aspect to it, which is something I think we're very much searching for in the midst of all this climate anxiety that we're feeling all of the time. And it seems like it has the potential to be generative to approach issues from a place of bewilderment. So I would just love to hear further perspectives on that, or how we can talk about bewilderment and Woolf, because I would agree with Kelly that it was also Woolf that got me into wanting to be like an eco-critic. So there's got to be something about that as to why we're all here. So I would love to hear more thoughts about bewilderment.
Thank you so much. Actually, I would start by making a connection with what you were saying, Rasheed, because I think when you talk about wildness and bewilderment, that also carries this risk, because it's been so often associated with a colonial sensibility. And in certain modernist writers, you see that. You don't have to think about primitivism, you know, as the very clear example of that. And that's something that Halberstam is attentive to in the book. So I think whether we're talking about the Anthropocene bewilderment, a lot of this is about how useful these terms are to think with, in the knowledge that we might be thinking with them for a period of time, and then language will change. We will find other concepts and other words that better address these kinds of issues. So you see the same problem in animal studies. There's a kind of constant anxiety about whether we say animal, non-human animal, animal, using Derrida's term, creature, beast. And actually, you know, in the end, you have to go with all of them to some extent, because the writers that we are looking at use all of them. So, you know, it's very difficult to say, no, we must just use the word creature. If Woolf herself, for example, is using animal or beast. So anyway, that's maybe going off a bit of a tangent. But in any case, yeah, I very much feel what you're saying, Rasheed, about that term Anthropocene and the kind of risks of using it, and the associations that come with it. And it's one of the things that Peter does beautifully in his book, is to show actually how we can productively think with the Anthropocene, as I alluded to in my paper, not as the aggrandizing of the human, but actually as this way of looking at how the human has been complacent, ignorant, and of its own limitations, of its own demise. Anyway, yes, on to Rihanna, what you actually asked about. Well, I suppose in the longer piece for Peter's volume, that's definitely one of the things that I'm trying to think through carefully. And it speaks to something Kelly mentioned in her presentation about, you know, how can we think formally about this relationship between collective and individual? And I always come back to Woolf's narrative techniques at this point. And I think one of the things that's so brilliant about all of the eco-critical animal studies, post-humanist approaches to Woolf, is that we're finding that there's this new vocabulary for not only describing what Woolf writes about, but the way that she writes about them. So, you know, I wonder sometimes, instead, could we completely discard stream of consciousness, let's say, which, you know, every year when I teach Woolf, it's the first thing students say. Why not talk about her narrative techniques as a kind of muddy type of writing, or a bewildered type of narration? You know, even the somewhat dry term free indirect discourse, actually we can be more specific. We can relate that more to Woolf by using some of these terms to think about the way the language itself works. And I find that quite exciting, to see these terms as a vocabulary that we can then put to use in describing the way Woolf writes. So in the bewilderment piece for the volume, you know, I have sections on the way that Woolf talks about herself being bewildered when she reads others, particularly, for example, the Russian writers. She's got, you know, some great passages when she's reading Dostoevsky, this feeling of a productive, positive bewilderment. There's passages from her own novels where she uses bewilderment in lots of different ways, including in comical ways. You can think about The Voyage Out, for example, and bewilderment's often used to kind of mock Terence during his courting with Rachel, that there's this sense that she's kind of sending up his disconnection from reality. So yeah, I think eventually I would want to get to the point where we're able to talk about Woolf's writing style and her techniques as a kind of bewilderment. Anyway, sorry, I talked far too long there. Over to someone else. Thank you.
That was great. Christina, I wonder if I could put you on the spot a little bit and I suppose pick up on this question of contrasts between present attitudes, and the kind of attitudes that were circulating in anticipation, in the concepts that seem to anticipate aspects of the Anthropocene. And I should say to anyone who hasn't read it, Christina has a fantastic article in Modernist Cultures, also on sort of questions of climate change and understanding of climate change in the early 20th century. And I guess, whether the degree to which these contrasting views can also provide a kind of steer or framework or contribution to I guess the kind of questions around activism or present challenges that came up in some of the other papers as well. If that isn't too huge a question.
I think just one thing that I was thinking in response to what's just been said is that these writers that I was looking at, the complete lack of bewilderment and the complete lack of humility and and sort of every pitfall that the term Anthropocene throws up of anthropocentrism and so on. They just jump into those pitfalls like both feet full on. And so it is primarily by way of contrast in some sense that they're useful to a discussion of what Woolf does. But I think the one thing that I'm still trying to work out is I do think that there is a way, and I was trying to think when you were talking about there's sort of an early Woolf moment in this sort of trajectory of her career. There's sort of an early Woolf moment and then a sort of 30s and 40s Woolf moment where she's really kind of engaging with these ideas. And something about there is something kind of Victorian or about the way in which Woolf conceives of, the sun is going to go out, the earth is going to be still. That's a very, she is informed by Huxley and Tyndall and this like idea of entropy. Like she is of her time in some senses, and yet she's also able to so not be of her time in some of the thoughts that she is able to think. And so I'm trying to figure out like how to consider the ways in which she is drawing from, where she is using, like Lancaster uses the idea of the cooling globe or this cooling cinder, and Woolf uses, in Mrs. Dalloway, cinder of ice, those kinds of, that there is a shared language and terminology there, and yet also this like huge departure. So yeah, I don't know what to do with those things, but but again, I think bewilderment is productive. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about the way in which those Victorian echoes persist into the 30s and 40s as well. The way in which, as Woolf's looking into the future, there's also part of her that's kind of anchored to the 19th century in certain attitudes. We're running dangerously close to 1:30 here. I'm going to suggest we let the conversation continue with the caveat and understanding that people, of course, will want to just disappear and take a break before the keynote. But I'm reluctant to, and Tori, if you need to leave and make me host, that's fine. Because I know how busy you are running all the other panels. Yeah, but I'm happy to continue if there's more questions or comments.
I also am happy to stay. I will say that I don't consider myself an eco-critic, and because I'm always approaching the pastoral, I think from inside sort of an aesthetic tradition or the literary, and you all have given me so much to think about that my brain is just seething. And I'm afraid that if I open my mouth to engage one idea, everything's going to come pouring out. So I'd love to stay and talk. But yeah, I also have been very aware that I don't want to monopolize anybody's time. So thank you all.
Let it all out.
Okay, nobody's leaving, so I'm just going to go for it. So a couple of things that have gotten knocked loose for me is that I've been trying to think about Between the Acts as a novel of pastoral over-determination. And for me, this is because you have the village pageant play, the sort of pastoral play, set within literally the country house. So there is this sort of what happens when you start to sort of over-determine the sort of like the over-conventional pastoral. So you get this pastoral novel, the pastoral play within the pastoral poem, within the pastoral novel, and the kind of fissures that creates. And trying to think about, yeah, there are like 17 different things happening here. So one of the things that you all have done for me today is to think about, well, those fissures are showing up as the primordial. And without the work that you're sort of doing in some ways on the Anthropocene, I wouldn't be thinking about that necessarily. So thank you. And I'm really interested in pursuing that. The other is about your question, Peter, about politics and ethics. And this chapter, this reading of Between the Acts was like an unwritten part of my dissertation, because I kept thinking about the way that the characters of the novel wander around the contained country house. It's almost like wandering around an island. There's almost like not an outside to the village. And trying to think about, is there any kind of, in the way that they encounter each other, is there any kind of ethics in this novel? And it seems to me that this novel over and over again is actually kind of like a failure of ethical behaviors. I think that people treat each other horribly in this novel. And I wanted to think about this novel in terms of like some kind of like pastoral care or ethics of care. And I just kept seeing the failure of it. And except into the end, somehow I always feel like this novel doesn't give us a model for any kind of ethical behavior, but it somehow at the end prepares us for an ethical encounter to come. That there is something in the act of reading this and being witness to these failures, the disappointments, and just everything that's happening in this country estate that prepares us for an ethical encounter to come. And there's something about that seems, I don't know, maybe that's more about the biopolitical or the political, but I don't think Between the Acts necessarily gives us an ethics in that way. And I'd be willing to hear thoughts about that. The very last thing and the very last strand is that the other thing I'd been thinking about was the way one might map the Tempest drama to the structure Between the Acts. And I see in Between the Acts a very similar macro structure to the way the Tempest operates, in that you have a lot of sorted characters wandering around, treating each other very badly, having very individual encounters with the landscape that then sort of throws into relief their different kind of moral quandaries. And two things happened today in this panel. Rasheed, your emphasis on comedy and drama made me think that these things are actually really connected. And so thank you so much for your paper today. And then the other was thinking about like the animations of nature that are happening in between the acts. And I keep thinking about Ariel and the way that art and nature are sort of interrelated. So that's a ton. I told you, I warned you all, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for such a rich set of ideas that have just kept catalyzing these things in my brain. So.
Thank you. Does anyone want to jump in on that? That question, that's a really productive question. It's a question of whether that is an ethics in between the acts. Yeah.
Because I kept wanting there to be one, and I felt like I couldn't find one. But I would be willing to be wrong. Like, is there a certain kind of, or ethical behavior or model for ethical behavior?
I wonder if this is something about the novel form and, you know, about literature actually, to be distinguished from philosophy, let's say, that actually Woolf doesn't give us an ethics in any one of her texts, but she creates the conditions in which we can think ethically, and perhaps even behave ethically as well. You know, I always, when I think of this question of, you know, does Woolf give us an ethics, or does she even kind of urges to follow some kind of political action? I always think about the way she talked about the Victorian novelists, you know, that sense that you know, you're not actually finished the book until you go off and join a club. That there's that sense in which I wonder if we not ask too much of a writer or of a novel, but we have to be careful about which questions we ask, because because literature is not philosophy or political theory, or even if it might open onto connections to those disciplines and those forms. Anyway, that's just some possibly slightly skeptical thoughts, actually. Anyway, on to someone else.
Well, I want to build on what you're saying, because I think this is really significant. Again, listen to the recording, write all this down in your paper, Derek, so we can cite it. But that idea that, let me see if I can grasp it all in my mind. So two things. One is the concern that as eco-critics, there is a tendency to have too much of a faith in what literature can do in terms of creating cultural change. And I think we always have to be wary of that, right? That it can do that, but and I don't think that means that it's not useful, though. I do think literature and reading it is incredibly useful to helping us revision, but understanding the limitations of that as well, too, right? So it's not that poetry doesn't make anything happen, but poetry is a voice that then changes, as Auden says, you know, that thing that comes afterwards that you go into. But I also think that what you're pointing up, Derek, that also relates for me to something Rasheed was saying as well, is there's, Shilo was mentioning that the characters are nice to each other. And one of the things that always interests me with Woolf is that she almost shows us things so that we can have a critiquing or different reaction. Like we're either supposed to laugh, like find that sense of humor through a mocking or through a critique, but that we are supposed to evaluate, as you say, Derek, she leaves us that space to play with. She opens that space. And this is why I think bewilderment and the not knowing, but the recognition of not knowing's productiveness is so important, because this is part of what I love about her writing, and words always mean more than one thing, so that she's always involving the reader and reader response. It's so important to why, I mean, if I was going to be on Desert Island Discs, I mean, I would definitely take either To the Lighthouse or Between the Acts, because you can reread them a million times, right? So there's just something there that I think is really significant to the, she's not, that sense of wanting to resist a message, resist a theme, resist an answer, resist an ethics, resist a politics, because it's in the resistance of that she makes us more aware of those questions and how we be in the world.
Well, and how the individual, how we respond to those individual characters in between the acts also, I think, ties it back to The Tempest in terms of the final two lines of the play, which really leaves it up to the reader how that play is going to end.
I guess I was sort of thinking in The Tempest, a resolution has been forced, right? Albeit by, somewhat violent means, and the subjugation of both Ariel and Caliban in the end. And so there's not even really, our hero doesn't give us moral behavior either in this play. And yet at the end, it's this sort of uncertain potential, like you get the sense they're supposed to be sailing off into a more moral world where things are better. And yeah.
I think that's left to the reader. And, it throws up that mirror in terms of how you see the end of that play.
It also relates to what Shinjini was talking about too, about that oscillation between the local and the transnational, right? How does that local place become a stand-in for the national, and then what ways, and I thought this was really interesting, Shinjini, what ways does it still have to be that local London with all of its details too, right? So that you feel and sense that place, because embodiment's also so important to Woolf. Just another dualism within Woolf to think about. You might want to say more about that, but these things brought you to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's also always the problem of having London as the center, because it's obviously the imperial center. And then what does it say about our eco-criticism or our Anthropocenic consciousness when we're having the center of imperialism as the microcosm of our eco-critical studies? And that kind of creates new questions about our approaches to both modernist transnationalism and the anthropogenic consciousness. But I think that's why Woolf is so fantastic, because Woolf is not representing London as the center of imperialism, but as a way to kind of deconstruct this imperial hierarchy. She is not representing London as superior to the colonial outposts, but as she's kind of approaching the colonial differences and kind of bringing the colonial outposts at the same level as London, and she's decolonizing this approach of both eco-criticism and transnationalism. And that's why I think that Woolf's cosmopolitan consciousness is so critical for understanding her climatic consciousness as well.
Can I just add really quickly, because I know Linda has a hand up, but I wanted to go to Leanna's comment in the, it's from a while ago, but Leanna writes, it's like the only ethics comes from when nature intervenes, since everyone else is so terrible to each other. And I'm wondering about, like, that made me think a lot about the idea of ethics and how they're operating in between the acts too, because, well, I mean, ethics is also about a kind of like attunement to nature, or a kind of like even a vulnerability towards nature, or to what is given by nature, or what is given by earth. And I'm thinking of that in terms of like a Derridian ethics too, where it's not about like having a program or an idea of like what is ethical behavior versus what is not ethical behavior, but rather that the sense of the ethical can only emerge in each encounter. So each encounter with nature, each way of thinking, each like, and in each encounter with nature, one is made vulnerable to what to what is expressed, whether that's cow song, whether that's even what happens in the barn, like these tiny noises and perceptions that no one hears because no one's listening to. And that kind of attunement as both reading practice, to borrow from both Peter's and Derek's ideas, or just some kind of like making oneself vulnerable, receptive in a way that unmakes the self, in a way that like doesn't allow the self to exist as the same self after the encounter. So so with this question, I'm always just kind of like baffled by what ethics, bewildered, I guess, to use Derek's phrase, but like what ethics should be. Like, is it about a certain way of acting? Is it like an attunement towards beings or the non-human world? Or is it about some set of practices to follow? I don't know, but I think, you know, there's something in it, in between the acts too, about like just being receptive, being, allowing oneself to be vulnerable, allowing like the encounter with not just nature, but with art, but with anything outside of the self, to kind of like shake the self out of self-preservation, to give up, to cede self in order to like be exposed to something else. And that something else is, you know, whatever we think of that as, the radical outside or radical otherness or nature, non-human being, whatever it is. Like yeah, like ethics is maybe just a way of getting outside of the self through nature or through some other experience.
I think that sort of leads into a little bit of what I was thinking, somewhat maybe simplistically, but that, you know, I mean, the term Anthropocene, I mean, the end of the Anthropocene is the end of us. And, you know, during COVID, I live in Manhattan in a high rise. I was thinking, you know, especially when the animals started coming out in various parts of the world during the shutdown, I was thinking, this is the end of the Anthropocene. This is what it will look like. It's not the end of the world, as sometimes people say. It's the end of humans. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Sorry, I'm, you know, a despairing American right now. And I also realize that Americans are, you know, as previously and maybe continuously, or English, you know, culpable for, you know, the problems of the Anthropocene and, you know, the various attacks on nature and those who live more closely to nature than we do. But I think Woolf kind of alludes to that. You know, when it begins with Swithin thinking about, you know, well, the shit coming up in the cesspool, but also Swithin about, you know, when the mastodons are in Piccadilly. And I think there's a little bit of hope in that, that the animals and nature will, I mean, some will die and some are dying, as we know, but they will continue, and those of us who have totally effed it up are doomed. But then ending with the artist's vision, although frankly, that last vision and going back to the, you know, heteronormative couple, even from a lesbian writer, is a little distressing. It's both simultaneously hopeful, it's creation, but it's also a very normative and oppressive story. That, you know, the novel has illustrated in the awful marriage and the, you know, brother-sister patriarchal relationship. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. I think that's such a useful insight, and it makes me think of Claire Colebrook, who's contributing a chapter to the volume as well, where she talks about an ethics of extinction, where maybe if we're thinking ethically and not thinking in a sort of anthropocentric ethics, we need to think the radical thought of, do we want life as it is to go on to the future, as it is to the future? Is that an ethical thought? I mean, that's skirting nihilism, which I think Colebrook herself would be the first to admit, but it's a sort of radical thought of what happens when we do think about a different kind of ethics, an ethics that isn't just about, you know, allowing humanity as it is, or the human in that sort of, you know, Western understanding of it, to just kind of carry on indefinitely doing harms.
I think that's one of the, sorry. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I find interesting in Woolf's sort of turn at various moments to a kind of idea of almost kind of the end of the time machine, where the earth is cold, like into the lighthouse, and Mrs. Dalloway, this sort of the sun gives no heat, and so on, that kind of image of, I think because it's entropic as opposed to like an Anthropocene idea, it is the end of everything. It is the end of all life, kind of, as opposed to just like human civilization and so on. And there definitely does sometimes seem to be a sense of like peace that she finds in that, a sort of, you know, the fear no more the heat of the sun. There's sort of a restfulness about, you know, heat death and so on. But that does also seem quite nihilistic. And I appreciate the fact that she's not sort of engaged in this energetic combating of it in the way that, you know, Lancaster and Arrhenius and Eckhom are, but also, yeah, are those the only two options is kind of an interesting question. And what you were saying, Linda, about the sort of, I guess the other option is that sort of image of the curtain rising on the pair at the end of Between the Acts. And this is totally incidental, but I was just at a conference where there was an anthropologist who was talking about how kind of long lasting the images of sort of like Neanderthal or like prehistoric life, the way in which they have these like nuclear family units and everybody is like industriously engaged in like producing goods and so on, in these like 1930s posters that they put up in schools illustrating you know, Neolithic life or whatever. And again, so I guess that's the third option, but also somehow a little bit sort of frustrating. So anyway, I have no end to this. This is
Can
just
I ask you a follow-up question? Can I ask you a follow-up question, Christina? So can I ask you a follow-up question? So Woolf, she was also reading like genes, right? And physicists. So is that the dualism, like that she's interested in breaking down matter to its elemental form? Is that a form of, I don't know, would you say that's still participating in nihilism, or is that about kind of the Latrobe at the end, you know, the creativity of breaking things down into those elemental pieces? Like, is there another scientist you'd put alongside that she was also reading that could maybe inspire a vision of that nihilism? Or maybe that's still nihilism. I don't know. What do you think of her interest in the physicist then, when you put that with what you're saying?
Yeah, where it doesn't have to be organic life that is the sort of vital thing. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good, yeah, I don't know where to go with that, but that's a good idea as well, putting the physics alongside the sort of biology.
And Peter had in the chat that you referenced Lynn Margulis. That's a great comparison.
Yeah, Lynn Margulis's answer, or I guess this is because she got tagged with sort of Gaia theory and this sort of, you know, idea of Mother Earth, and her response was always to point to a very de-romanticized understanding of planetary systems that she actually intended behind it, which was to say, you know, we don't really need to worry about life continuing, because, you know, life will continue. And she points to this example, this extreme example of bacteria in nuclear waste tanks, and this idea that actually, you know, we might have a nuclear holocaust and life will still thrive in some form. But I guess, and hearing what Christina and Kelly, you were saying about sort of physics, makes me think actually what is at stake here is a certain definition of life, both sort of epistemologically, but also ethically, you know, what the meanings and values that we attach to that word life. Yeah, that's I'm aware we're going almost for 2 hours here, and I'm really wary of not eating into plenary time, because people will want to go and see Peter Stansky's plenary, I'm sure. So maybe we should wrap it up here. If there's maybe final short comments from people other than me, I don't want to sort of colonize the chat.
Just a very round thank you, Peter, for convening this group of people together and putting together this volume. I'm so excited, not just to sort of finish, writing about rats and maggots for it, but also to read the contributions of all of the other thinkers you've assembled. I'm incredibly excited for this project. So thank you so much for this.
Oh, me too.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
And let's hope we can continue this conversation next year at Woolfian Ecologies, which seems like a fitting year for our collection to come out in.
This opened up so many new ways for me to think about Woolf. It was just incredible.
Thank you.
I'm wondering.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Peter?
Yes.
I want a copy of your book. I